So first of all, I'm going to give a big harimai to Tracy and everybody else on the call, and I'm going to show off my skills a little bit with an opening karakia, because I'm giving this the flavor of the focus that Tracy is going to be enlightening us with today. So it's an incantation, basically, or this is what a karakia is, for those who don't know what a karakia is. So it's Tuiaki Ronga, Tuiaki Raro, Tuiaki Roto, Tuiaki Waho, Tuiate Here Tangata, Tuturu Ofiti, Whakamoa Kiatina, Tina, Haumie, Huie, Taikie. And for those of you who need a quick translation, basically it means stitch the celestial energies to the terrestrial energies within and without, bind the kinship strands of humanity, permanent, consistent to the fibers of light, draw these matters to a single point and give them substance. The wisdom is bound, it collects, and then ends with it is held. So with that, I'm going to really welcome the amazing, and as she was once described by a colleague of ours, formidable Tracy Karanui Gulf. And I'm really very pleased to have Tracy. And thank you so much for accepting to do this, which is a little bit later than the usual schedule, so it expands your day out a bit more. But thank you so much, Tracy, for agreeing to do this. Just by way of very quick introduction, because I'm pretty sure that Tracy is going to cover a lot more about herself in this talk, because that's part of the remit. Tracy, I have a working relationship with Tracy currently at Massey University in Auckland, and Tracy's our Kai Aki is a Maori advisor essentially, and we met probably about a year and a bit ago. I think it may have been April or May. I forget the exact sort of month we met. And literally for me it was love at first sight, and I really did enjoy the conversations, and still do enjoy sharing in talks and listening to the amazing perspectives that Tracy has about our profession, and specifically from an Indigenous perspective, looking at how speech and language therapy may be shifted through views that perhaps are not, and arguably are not dominant in our field. So without much further ado, as they say, I'm going to hand you over to Tracy, who I'm hoping will enlighten us and really give us, I'm sure, an amazing set of ideas to talk about towards the end of the session. So over to Tracy.
No pressure, my friend, no pressure. Kia ora, everybody.
Is that me, or are you frozen, Tracy? Oops. Okay, so this looks like we have a technical issue. Is everybody else there? Okay, Tracy, you back?
Yeah, did I go somewhere?
You did. You just, but I'm not sure if there's only for me. Can anyone else confirm? May have been, I think. Okay, start again if you don't mind.
Okay. Ka muri ka muri, or speech language therapy. I don't know how much you heard of that, but it's a whakatauki, or kind of a proverb in our Māori, or in the Indigenous First Nations people of New Zealand, and it means walking backwards into the future, saying that we mustn't forget what has been, the things that have got us here, and we must take those things into what we want ahead. So next slide, please. So Mershon just did a karakia with us. So karakia traditionally really was a form of well-being. And what's happened over time in New Zealand is that we have a little bit turned that idea of karakia into a process without the same purpose. So now when I have a hui like this and I talk about karakia, I try to give people a feeling of what the notion of karakia actually is. So this clip here is going to take 3.5 minutes, and it's going to feel like the longest 3.5 minutes of your life. you're going to keep thinking, I wonder if it's going to stop. And as that's happening, I want you to read the words at the top of the screen and actually follow those instructions. And as those thoughts come into your mind that this is kind of taking a bit long, I want you to put into reality that that 3.5 minutes is just that 3.5 minutes. And it's a reminder to show us how little time we spend on our own well-being. And that when we're at work, we're always kind of on the rush. So if you can play that video for us, this is called a ko'owo, and it is a Māori flute played in a ngahere or a native forest in New Zealand. Annalie, can you play the clip, please?
Anelia, you'll have to unmute yourself. I think you are unmuted, hey?
We're having real technological issues. That's
You
okay.
are unmuted. Okay.
Okay, I have a trick to do. Show it now. Okay, include the sound. Press over this. Yeah, I think now it should be good.
Thank you, Annalie. So how did that, you guys can just come off mute and talk to me, but how did you find that? Did anybody think that was a long 3 minutes? Didn't feel too long? When I first started doing it for 3 minutes, I felt like it was too long. I felt like I needed to shorten it and rush it. And I think that's one of the big takeaways when working with whānau Māori, I think, is just to reframe our perception of time and what we need to do quickly and what we need to take our time with. And our own well-being is something that we need to take our time with. So that was both a karakia of time to share together. So to share breath, or the ha is what we talk about in our Māori, and to show you how we're so in tune to just rush. So I'm going to tell you my pepeha, and that tells you a little bit of where we're from. And why we do this in Māori is to make connections. So ko whangataua tia te maunga, ko ngāhere te awa, ko māmari te waka, ko ahipara te whenua, ko te raroa tuku iwi, ngā te moepunga tuku hapu, and o hake tuku marae. So my name's Tracy Karanui Golf. I hail from the mighty lands of Ahipara, which are just right up there by that yellow arrow. And in New Zealand, we're just that tiny little dot by that red arrow that you can't really see. I'm a trained speech and language therapist. I work mostly as a court-appointed communication assistant. So that means I work in justice, care and protection and mental health, contracted talking trouble, and I do some time at Massey as well. So my journey to speech and language therapy has been an interesting ride. When I first enrolled into the program, I enrolled because my marriage had broken up and I needed something new to do. And when I first did the interview, the person who interviewed me said to me, we only have 25 spots and the statistics tell us that you're not going to make it. So if you want to get in, you need to do these 4 papers first and pass with an A- average, and then we'll consider letting you in. And at the time, I didn't really think about what that meant, but as my journey in the program started and my life in speech and language therapy began, I realized what she meant by those statistics. And I was pretty determined to prove those statistics wrong. So here we are today. Next slide, please. So decolonisation, that's a massive word. And I think even the word decolonisation is triggering for people. So I spent time kind of trying to figure out what I was going to talk about and how I was going to break that down. So I did a big brainstorm to myself about what does decolonisation mean to me? What am I really doing in my work? So I broke it down into these 3 components: is to recognise, to indigenise, and then to mobilise. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. I'm going to break down those 3 concepts. Next one, please. And again, so this one's to recognise. So, as I said before, the word colonisation is loaded and it's really tricky for people to actually measure. In our society, we've kind of normalised the social cultures and we have it in these ingrained social narratives that we don't even hear anymore. They've just become so normalised. So it becomes difficult for people to really critically consider the impacts of colonisation. And I heard something from one of my colleagues and now good friends, Dr. Susan Pitama, who said colonisation manifests as determinants in health, housing and education. And that was a huge statement for me. And I've based so much of my work now on that small statement. And I'm going to show you how it manifests as determinants in health, housing and education in relation to speech, language and communication needs. Okay, next one. So I think the next slide talks to us about how health, access to health. And I've chosen to talk about hearing health, one, because I have a passion for hearing health, and also because this is one of the biggest barriers that I see in my work as a communication assistant in justice. So many of the people that I meet have hearing impairment or think they've got hearing impairment. So I just wanted to talk through 3 of the things that I think relate to this, that I see in New Zealand happening for First Nations peoples here. One of the things is identification. So if you don't now in New Zealand have photo ID, it's really difficult to sign up to a GP practice or have a general practitioner. And if you can't sign up to a GP, then you don't have somebody monitoring your overall health and the overall health of your children. You kind of just turn up to emergency rooms or drop-in doctors, and you don't have a doctor having a good overview of what's happening for you. What then happens is we have these things called DNA, which means did not attend. And a friend of mine, Elaine McKee, we were doing a video the other week, and she said, instead of did not attend, maybe we call it did not attract. And so DNA means the person did not attend the appointment. So in New Zealand, if you miss 2 appointments with a specialist, say you've been referred to audiology, if you miss those 2 appointments, you get discharged from the service and they call you a DNA. So if you don't have a GP and you don't have someone following up on that house and your address changes a bit, then you have a higher risk of getting a DNA, because how do they contact you and who lets you know about that stuff? Which feeds into this kind of different worldview. And is it a different worldview, or is it bias or racism? So I've called the DHBs on times and spoken to the booking clerks or the audiology booking clerks and said, look, not in my CA role, but when I was working in one of the deaf education schools, I rang frequently, and they would say to me, well, they didn't attend. Everybody else can get there, why can't they? And for a long time, I kind of said, well, maybe they just don't understand the cost of petrol. Maybe they just don't understand that there's not a vehicle. Maybe they don't understand it's hard to bring 8 children. But actually, I've got to the point now where I'm saying, well, then they need to understand. And that if we've got professionals working at the cold front with very vulnerable whānau, at what point are we saying it's not just a different worldview? This is systemically racist and biased. So that's a health example. Next one. Okay, this is about housing. So I talk about this lots when I am spending time in the courts as well, because I think people don't really always easily understand the relationship between housing, speech, language, and communication. So imagine if you grow up in your same community, or your children are growing up in the same community. So you've lived at the same house for a year, or maybe 2 years, maybe 5, maybe even 10 years. Within your community, you've established these really good relationships with children around you, with your neighbours, just with the people in your community. And within those spaces, children get the opportunity to have lots of different experiences. So they learn to develop higher level language skills like compromise and negotiation. They learn how to adapt their communication skills dependent on the house that they're going to. They might be going to a Pacifica family or a family from the Pacific Nations, where they know they're going to sit on mats and they talk differently in that house to when they go to a Palangi or a New Zealand European person's house where there's furniture and couches. And they learn how to fluidly move between those worlds. So you can imagine, as speech language therapists, you know all the language and learning opportunities that come with that. The same goes with healthy homes. If you have a healthy, stable home, you're more likely to be able to go to school and to be able to develop relationships around you. So the next slide gives you some statistics on one of the, you can flip along, Anili. The next slide gives you some statistics of what's happening in Rotorua, which is a city in the middle of the North Island in New Zealand. So there you can see that the percentage of non-Māori to Māori people in emergency housing. So in New Zealand, that means you've got nowhere to live. And so they might put you in a motel or an emergency housing block. So these emergency housing blocks are all over different cities in New Zealand. And in Rotorua, 82% of those are filled with Māori whānau. So when we have children coming to school who have had to move house often because they don't have stable housing. So if they've gone to emergency housing and they've moved, sometimes I've met children who have moved, 8 times in 2 years. Or I met a boy the other day and his family had moved 6 times in 7 months. And 3 of those times they were outside of school zones. So you can imagine if your child was having to move school every new school year, how that would impact on the way that they developed relationships with peers and teachers. So when you, again, when you develop healthy relationships in a school, you learn how to tolerate authority. You learn how to understand that your teachers have got the best in mind for you. You learn how to navigate spaces with your friends by saying, no, I wasn't in it morning tea time, you were in it morning tea time, it's my turn now. Or no, I did the rubbish bins yesterday, it's your turn today. When these kids don't have that opportunity to develop those skills, they get into positions in new schools all the time where they're left with very little skills and language and communication skills to navigate those spaces. Next one, please, Lily. So if you want to ask anything or say anything, just jump in, okay? I can't see you all on the bottom, but we can just have a chat through this as well. I don't need to just talk to you about it if you want to say something. And this is what we were just talking about, school and education. So the impacts of colonisation education are partly what I was just talking about around developing those networks, safe and trusting relationships, but also exposure and instruction. So if you're going to school and you don't have the language and communication skills to navigate the world socially, then all of your energy is spent up on that side of coping, and you don't have the energy or the focus for explicit instruction. So you're not learning to read and write and use language like other children who have had stable housing, stable education, and had access to healthcare. Next one. So this is a kind of a whittle, or what we say a challenge to reframe. So on the left-hand side is typically what we hear people talking about. So we hear people saying Māori are overrepresented. Māori children are more likely to require intervention and assistance, and Māori are less likely to engage. And I think that on the surface, that can be what it looks like. But actually what we need to do is to recognise, this is the first part, to recognise the impacts of colonisation so that we can start to decolonise the spaces. So let's reframe that whakaaro into Māori are more likely to be exposed to risk factors. So Māori are more likely to be exposed to emergency housing and unstable schooling. Instead of Māori children are more likely to require intervention and assistance, let's say Māori are likely to have experienced resource barriers, like accessing the doctor or being able to pay for a photo ID passport or driver's license. Instead of Māori are less likely to engage, let's say Māori are more likely to have been offered services that do not align. And what that means is that they've had services offered to them in often a Western approach without the embedding of the values and principles that their lives are based around. And so it can look like they haven't wanted to engage, or they don't care about the assessment. And I've heard people say they don't care about the children, when actually what's being offered to them doesn't align with their own measures of well-being. So what are your thoughts on this one? Has anyone got anything to kind of say about this reframing? Do you think that the stuff on the left is more of what you've heard and the stuff on the right is not often what you've heard? What do you think? Does anybody, what do you think, Mershan?
Absolutely, and I think for me, I agree with the whole strategy to reframe, because then it points towards a system that marginalizes rather than looking at further victimizing victim in that way. So I think just the whole notion, the strategy of reframing reminds people constantly to look really where is the problem. So I think that's definitely
And it's
something.
that recognizing that's the problem, though, isn't it? I think we're not talking often about why or how people get into the situation. So we're just looking at the deficit without the process to the deficit. So we're talking about kids with otitis media without talking about the fact that they haven't been able to see a doctor. Okay, can we see the next one, please? So these are some of the things that I've been doing in my work at the recognise stage. So, and Talking Trouble has some amazing work going on, and we're developing some modules in Rise, which is a learning platform, and I've been working particularly on 2 modules there. One we called Tikanga Hauora, which was about cultural competency and helping the therapists that work for Talking Trouble to develop Tikanga Hauora, which translate to cultural responsiveness. And also we've developed a whole assessment module on a model of assessment called the Meihana model, which I'll show you a little bit later. And more recently, I organised a racism workshop in Auckland. This is a save the date for the next one that's coming up, so I'll talk to you about that later too. But I think what I'm trying to say is that the recognise stage helps us to think about either what skills we need to develop ourselves or what skills we need to help the therapists around us develop. And that's thinking about the barriers and New Zealand in a historical, social context. Okay, next one, please. So this is the Meihana model, and I think this is a really nice model. I use this model like every day in my work, and this is a really nice model to help us think about how a person manages themselves in a colonised country as a First Nations people. So this model is specifically for Māori, for assessment with Māori, and it looks at factors of colonisation and factors of our Māori. So I encourage you to have a look at that model if you're trying to develop your skills in the recognise component. Next one. Okay, the next one is to indigenize. So I think this is probably this is the difficult part. This is where there's such a fine line, like a real balance between how do we indigenize without marginalizing. And that is my big worry as a speech and language therapist, is that we can kind of sway so far from one team into the other, which can end up in kind of marginalizing behaviors. So I get really concerned when I hear speech language therapists say things like the whānau are in trauma, their lives are too stressed and busy, they don't have time for speech and language therapy. because I think that that's how we end up with the young people that I see in my work with Talking Trouble every day, who are 14, 15, 16, 17, and have significant language problems, have significant difficulties with literacy. Many of them can't read, and if they can only read very simple words and very short sentences. And they don't have the communication skills to be able to navigate themselves with mana, so with pride. And then on the other hand, we have a discipline that is based on pathologizing. And so we have this this kind of system that says we can't help unless we can say that there's something wrong. And so that doesn't feel right either, because all of a sudden people were just living their lives and they see a speech language therapist and then they've got some kind of language disorder. So I think that it's a really hard balance, and I think this is where we need to work really hard in New Zealand to try and get the balance right. Because for me, to indigenize is not to marginalize. Okay, next slide, please. And this is what I think the big difference is with our Māori compared to Western science. So mātauranga talks about knowledge. So that's just like we all have knowledge, and our clinical decision-making skills as speech language therapists are based on our clinical knowledge or our mātauranga. So in Māori, we have mātauranga, we have Indigenous science. So that is knowledge that's been passed down through our ancestors for generations, and it's taonga, or it's special to us. It's like a treasure. But then we have these other layers. So we've got these layers that we don't seem to have in Western science, or that aren't explicit like they are in our Māori. So we've got tikanga, which is the rules. It's kind of how you roll. It's like how you engage. And that's flexible and it's changing. Our tikanga is changing as the world progresses. We're doing things now that wouldn't have been tika or would have been right tikanga even 5 years ago before the pandemic. But there's a set of principles that all align, and even when our tikanga changes, those base principles stay the same. And then we have takepu, which is about values. And those values are how we live our lives. So we talk about things like whakawhanaungatanga, which is about relationship building. We talk about mana, which is about pride. And we talk about aroha, which is about connection and what can be translated to love. So when we're talking about Indigenous knowledge, we're not ever just talking about Indigenous knowledge. We're talking about the what should we do, Indigenous knowledge, and the how, or no, the why, probably, the tikanga, the why do we do it this way? And then the how, which is a takepu, or the principles. So you're talking about what you need to do, but you're also talking about why and how. Where in Western science, even when we're at university, we're often just teaching the what's. What do you do? What do you test? What do you use to test? And I think that what we need to be doing is to be teaching these layers of consideration around our Māori. Next one, please. Because this is what we want in the end. We want an infusion versus an insertion. So if we think of the blueberry muffin here, in the infusion, things become kind of so blended that they're still different things. One's still a batter and one's still a muffin, but they're infused together that you can't even really pick them apart. It's just the muffin. Or you have the muffin where you can literally just pick out and put back in the berries. And that's mostly what we've got at the moment. So we have, we might have Māori principles in a policy, but those policies are not, but the mahi is not being enacted in a way, those policies not infused in everything that we do. So I think we want to be getting to a point where we've got infusion of our Māori, not just not just to Māoriify, or not just to put these bits of our Māori in to look like it's Māori. Next one, please. And this one really is about how you do it. And this is really what it comes down to a lot of the time. It's about sharing power. And if you want, if you've got opportunity in the mahi that you do to be able to share the power with Indigenous people that you work with, that is how the infusion happens. Because the value of mātauranga Māori seems to be valued so much less than the clinical or the scientific knowledge that kind of sits up here. We've got these hands that want to take mātauranga Māori knowledge and just kind of pick it from the basket. And I think there's so much power to be had, so much to be gained from shared power. So my work at Talking Trouble, Sally's on. Hi, Sal. Hi, Sally. There's Sally. My work at Talking Trouble, I can just do whatever I want to do, however I want to do it. And I don't have barriers, like I don't have walls put up around me saying, oh, you can't really do that, because we shouldn't really say stuff like that. And it means that we've really been able to get stuck in, and we've developed a whole assessment model based around that Meihana model. And I just don't think that would happen in lots of other places, because we would be questioned about, well, is it fair to have a Māori-centric assessment model? And I think that, yeah, it's fair because of the stuff that I just talked about and the risk factors involved with colonisation. And if we can share the power, then we can start to see some of that infusion. Next one. Sorry, I obviously don't have control of the slides. So this is a whakatoki, and this is a mangopure, or a hammerhead shark. And I just think it's a really good reminder for us. You can see the two pathways here. So I'm a huge advocate for really good clinical practice. And like I said, I don't want people to be marginalised because they think that's how we need to indigenize. Because I don't think it is. I think people still need good access to medical opinions. They still need the benefits of Western science, but the Māori family also need our Māori to balance up, to add those layers of well-being. So that design there is to remind you to use those two knowledge pathways. Next one. So this is another research paper that I encourage you to look at. It's called The Braided Rivers. It's by a beautiful Māori researcher here in Aotearoa called Angus McFarlane. And he talks here, you can see in this visual that he talks about the braided rivers approach being knowledge of our Māori and knowledge of Western science, and how they live on their own, but when they cross over beautifully, just smoothly, without rips in the water or deep rock pools to fall into. And I think that the braided rivers approach is a really nice way to remind us how to keep a balance between the two knowledge bases. Next one. So an indigenised mahi, this is for the New Zealand speech language therapists. I don't know if there's many of you in here, but on February the 8th and 9th, we will have a 2-day wānanga on indigenising speech and language therapy in New Zealand. We've got some incredible people coming to spend the 2 days with us. We've got Dr. Susan Pitama, who wrote the Meihana model. She's going to come and spend half a day talking to us about the Meihana model in our mahi. We've got Heather Kane, who's coming to do the critical treaty analysis workshop with us. And for 2 days, I'm going to have a kaiako from Te Wānanga or Aotearoa, who's going to come and help us embed Indigenous knowledge across those 2 days. So we've got Susan and Heather coming to talk to us about policy and clinical services, and we'll have Kelly embedding Mātauranga Māori or Māori bodies of knowledge throughout those 2 days. So, so from an indigenised mahi perspective, I think it's about providing opportunities that actually teach and show us how to use bicultural models of working. Next one. Okay, and the last concept I wanted to talk to you about, I've got 2 minutes, is to mobilise, and that's actually to how do you get this stuff done. So we've done to recognise, we've figured out what's going on, we've got to indigenise, we've got to think about what bicultural models might help us, and have we got a balance of Western science and Mātauranga Māori, and now we've got to think about how we actually action some of that. And I think that's the really hard stuff, is people are like, yeah, I get it, but how do I actually action it? Okay, next one. And this is as far as I'm going to take it, and I think it's that in New Zealand we have Te Tiriti o Waitangi, or the Treaty of Waitangi, which is a founding document on New Zealand. And there are 2 versions of it, Te Tiriti and the treaty. They're not quite the same, and I'm not going to go into too much of that today because it's a big concept and we don't have time for that. But if we go on to the next slide, I'm going to show you that there's 4 articles in the treaty. So there's 4 things that the treaty says that we have to do when we practice. And I think that as we're thinking about how do we mobilise, how do we actually execute some of this stuff and get it going, we can use Te Tiriti o Waitangi because it is the law. We have to do it. All of our funding in the DHBs and the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Justice, and actually the New Zealand Speech Language Therapy Association, everything that we work for, everyone we work for, says that we have to be doing work that aligns with Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Now, when I did the racism conference, and I asked at the racism conference to the group of speech language therapists there, if I asked you if you could align your assessment or your report or your mahi with the articles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, could you do that? And no speech language therapist in the room could do that. And I don't think that's a reflection on them having poor practice. I think it's a reflection that our discipline in New Zealand has been predominantly Western based, and that the value for Mātauranga Māori and the obligations to Te Tiriti have not been given the value and the time that they deserve and need. And so what I've started to do in Talking Trouble now is, and in my supervision, I provide supervision, I'll talk to you about that too, is to really start talking about and teaching these articles and what they mean in practice. So we've just got I've just got one more slide to talk to you about, and then I was hoping that we could get you all to be brave and come onto the camera and have a conversation, because it's a wānanga, and in our Māori we talk, and that's how we get through things, and how we learn things. It's about wānanga and just having discussions. So I'd love to kind of have a discussion about what these might look like in practice. So kāwanatanga is about governance or partnership. Tino rangatiratanga is about self-determination or autonomy. Ngā tikanga katoa is about equality, and te ritinga Māori is about the protection of spiritual practices. Now that can all just feel really fluffy, like how is that actually going to fit in? But it really can, it really can. So for example, Article 1, kāwanatanga, planning the assessment so that the person has autonomy, they have some governance over how that assessment will happen, is Article 1. So today I've been talking to a social worker. I've been trying to get an assessment done with a rangatahi who's had been in really complex life for the last month, and I've not been able to meet up with him because he's just saying, I'm sick of people, I'm not meeting any more people, I don't want any more tests. And so I had a phone call with him and a social worker today, and I said, well, what could work? I just want to talk to you for a little bit, maybe even 15 minutes, what might work? And he said, oh, could we just talk at McDonald's? And I was like, yeah, we can just talk at McDonald's. So I phoned McDonald's in my local to me and booked the little glass meeting room. And tomorrow he will bring his social worker and I'll see what I can get done in that meeting room at McDonald's. And that's about partnership. That's about governance. That's about letting him have some responsibility over how my mahi happens with him. Okay, the last one. Oh, next one. Might be running out. Oh, and the other way that I've been mobilising is by this year I've done a postgraduate diploma in bicultural supervision called Whatu, and it's by me and for us. And what that model is based on is tu tiriti, so that means to stand for the Treaty of Waitangi, and it's about blending Western science with te tiriti o Waitangi and principles of ao Māori to support our whānau to be able to engage in speech and language therapy. Because I think our profession has so much to offer my people, and I see that at the justice end, people are really desperate for help, but actually they've been desperate since primary school. I have so many mothers saying to me that they knew that there was something wrong, but they didn't know how to get help, or that the help they got didn't fit. And I think we have so much to offer our Māori whānau, but I think that there's a lot that we're missing that as a profession here in New Zealand we need to be focusing on and kind of recognising the gaps, thinking about how to indigenize those gaps, and then making a plan to mobilize those gaps. So I think that's it. Is there another one? Yeah, so this is our flag. So no, that's it from me. I was hoping we could just kind of have a discussion, have a bit of a Q&A. If you've got anything to ask me about any of that, we can go back to the slides. But don't be shy.
Hi, Tracy. It's Harsha here. I joined in just as you got started, so sorry I didn't get a chance to say hello. But I really was fascinated by your presentation and everything that you have to offer. So I'm wondering if I can kick off with a question and comment, and then we can all join in and have a discussion. So, I mean, I really think, everything that you've said and done speaks so much to the practice of decolonization. So how we do it, how we're thinking it, what are we challenging, etc. So the many different layers. And so at the one point, I see how important it is for us to read the systemic issues, the political issues. The point that I really would like you to speak a little bit more about is around the spiritual, because that seems to be a gap that everyone struggles with. And here in South Africa, it's such an important part of people and well-being. So I'm just wondering if you have any ideas to share with us around how you bring that into the conversation and bring it into focus for our work.
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, and it's a tricky question. And I think it's a tricky question for all First Nations practitioners around, or people working with First Nations people, and that's because of the disconnection that's happened from our language and our culture. So in New Zealand, we have nearly as many non-Māori people speaking Māori as Māori people. And we have lots of people that aren't connected to their lands or their maraes anymore. So if somebody was to ask them, do you know your iwi or do you have cultural needs? They would say no, because they don't want to, they don't want to be put on the spot and have someone all of a sudden ask them if they want to karakia or start to speak Māori to them. And two, because they don't know what those cultural things mean. But I think despite disconnection, innately Māori people are spiritual connected people. So we talk about principles like Mauri. So Mauri is like an energy or a life force. So how I talk to speech language therapists about that at the moment is like a vibe. So, you know, when you feel something and it's just not right, it's just off. You can't really name it. You're not sure what it is, but there's a vibe. So we in Māori, we call that mauri. And that mauri means something. So if I meet a young person and I feel that mauri, I say to them, aroha mai, I'm sorry. I know that you don't want to do this. I can feel that. So I'm acknowledging what I can feel, and that isn't what they're used to, because people are like, well, what's the problem? So we're asking children who have language disorders, who don't know how to explain the feeling, what the problem is. And it's valuing those feelings, those innate human connections that you have inside you, and giving them value. Because in Western science, like I said, we just have that kind of one layer of clinical, what you need to do. But in like one of the takipu would be Māori. So one of those principles, I said, there's what you do, the mātauranga Māori, the tikanga, the how you do it, and then the takipu, or the principles of why you do it. So one of those spiritual connections is Māori. So if you feel that Māori's off, you need to address that or not do it. It's really simple, but I think lots of it's too based just thinking about what that person's lived experiences have been, and whether they've had opportunity to know the words, the spiritual and cultural words connected to their culture. We can't assume that they do. I don't know if that's helpful at all.
Yeah, just for everyone to just join in the discussion, because I just think it creates such a point of important reflection for us, because in our texts, in our practice, it's almost deliberately kept out.
Yes.
Kind of the spirituality, the connection, and yet communication is all of that.
Absolutely. So another example could be mana. And so mana is about like how you feel about yourself, your pride. And so I've had a very, very tricky young person that I've been working with. And when I first met him, I don't have a jersey, but he would put his hoodie right over his head and tie it with the string. And he'd just look at me through a little bit in his hoodie like that. And that's how I spoke to him. And we did talking mats. That's how we mostly did it. And now we've got to the point where I've signed off for his last family group conference, which is like a court process, and his last visit to court. I'm not going to go. He's going to go with himself, with his whānau, with his communication passport, and because he's going to finish, he's going to leave the youth court now. He's done all the things he needed to do. So he can leave that process with his mana, knowing that him and his whānau stood for themselves at the end, and I didn't need to be there to help him give his voice. So it's about kind of giving back that spiritual connection of mana, and knowing as professionals when it's our time to make sure that we're not taking positions that that should really stand with whānau.
Can I maybe just comment on that? If there's no one else that has a question or comment. I think that's really, really important to look at, just in terms of the way you've understood spirituality and how it's been infused, to use your own words, in your practice, right? And here's where what you've said I have a battle with in looking at how speech and language therapy teaches, okay, and what we value. And so where's our competence for that sort of thinking around being in the world and around spirituality, but more so the actual debate. So the fact that that actually mainstream Western Eurocentric speech and language therapy comes from a very, very different worldview. Now it's got to compete with that, what you've just described, right? And so there's going to necessarily be a clash, not necessarily a merging of these ideologies. And that's when the sparks fly, and then somebody's got to win that battle. And if you're looking at how those battles are fought, it'll come down to, well, let's know what speech therapy does. Here's the list of competencies that we've got in terms of what we think is effective speech therapy, and it's not now prescribed learning outcomes. So actually it's nice to have, but it's not really a focus of what we do. So that's what I'd like for us to think about, is how we fight that fight, and how do we work with those kinds of forces. Yeah, just thoughts on that.
Sally, are you on, Sally? Can you talk? Sally and I did a course this week where it was a mātauranga Māori, practicing infusing mātauranga Māori, and they are actually testing you on it. You can get NZQA credits for it. And how did you find it, Sal, that whole actually being marked for your cultural competency stuff? Is she still on?
Yeah, it was. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you? Yeah, you can. Okay. Yeah, it was good. It's important. And I suppose I don't know if we can ever be competent, like really, but I suppose if we're measuring our knowledge and our skills, and there were some of the tasks that we needed to do, and I was working in a group with Tracy and 2 other women, and sometimes I would think, gosh, you know, this is stuff Tracy should do, but actually we have to be competent. There's not enough Tracys. Like if I could bottle Tracy, that would be amazing, because we need millions of Tracys, but that isn't our reality. And so people like me need to work out, how can we be skilling ourselves up and being good allies and knowing how to share our power, because we have power and we have privilege. If we're not Māori working with Māori, we need to step up. I didn't know if I answered that question, Tracy. Sorry, no, it's been a long day.
No, I know. No, you did. It's just thinking about the fact that we don't, and because Andre was talking, the course was by Andre McLaughlin, and he was talking about the fact that professions don't measure this stuff, just like you're saying, Mershon, that actually you learn all the clinical competency, but who's actually making sure that our people are safe? Like the Te Tiriti block courses are not good enough. Like, how are we going to make sure that people actually can do the safe practice? What experiences are they getting?
Tracy, I've got something else I want to suggest as well, and that's what people value and who has the power to say what's important. Like I run Talking Trouble, I'm the director, and everyone has to do this stuff. It's like that's the expectation. So I think if you have got power, you can choose how you use your power. So there is an expectation that everyone has to complete these courses and demonstrate this knowledge, and that Tracy has got power to help us to make it happen. And so I guess it's also who chooses to do what they can with what their privilege allows as well.
Yeah. And it's made such a huge difference. Like I'll say to Sal, what do you think about this? And she'll say, well, just if you think it's good, just do it. So now I just do things. I only need to run it past her if I know that it's kind of something brand new or different. But I don't have that constant kind of checking of filtering of my thoughts, filtering of my ideas. I know that I have autonomy to say the things that I want to say, obviously in a kind and respectful way, always with mana and aroha. But that I don't have to fear kind of, being boxed in. And I think that if all the Māori SLTs that were working felt like they could have the autonomy to do that, maybe we'd see a bit more of that infusion.
David,
does anyone?
I saw your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So I can tell you something about the developments in Australia, which I found quite remarkable. So actually, Speech Pathology Australia was sort of the initiating force to ask universities to make changes to their curriculum in the sense of including more First Nations perspectives and also, putting cultural responsiveness sort of into the new code of ethics and also into the new professional standards. And yeah, I was really surprised by that, because for a while I thought there will never be change in our profession and it'll forever stay conservative and will forever argue there's only one knowledge, and that's the Western knowledge, basically. And so, yeah, I'm now in the position to be able to sort of change the curriculum on the basis of this change at the professional level. So, yeah, I found that really exciting. And also, I've been at the conference where the profession actually delivered an apology to the First Nations people.
Wow.
And also that was pretty moving, and it seemed to be a little bit coming out of nowhere, but maybe not nowhere, but rather, people who have successfully lobbied Speech Pathology Australia to initiate that change. And I'm really hopeful that this will lead to a lot of work in exactly that field. How can we decolonize speech pathology? And also, I'm sort of wondering, how can all clients benefit from, say, such a bicultural model? And that will be a question for me, for Tracy. So, would you suggest that actually not only to change practices, speech pathology practices with Maori clients, but basically to invite everyone to benefit from considering these additional dimensions that in one way or other are important for every person, I think.
Right, yeah. And I think if we go back to that phrase that I used before that said Māori are more likely to be exposed to risk factors, there's two reasons why I focus on Māori. That reason, because Māori are more likely than other nations to be exposed to risk factors here in New Zealand, and Te Tiriti or Waitangi. Those kind of other the guiding principles of why we should be Māori-centric in Aotearoa. But the values and the practices align with us as human beings. So Western science kind of only looks at the deficit of the person. We might talk about family sometimes in an assessment context, but not in the same depth or with the same consideration that you do in Māori. And the things that we talk about are good for everybody. We say in New Zealand, what's good for Māori is good for all. And so if we get it right for First Nations peoples, we'll get it right for all minority people and for non-minority people, because they're still human. And all we're doing is offering the resources and the access that privilege has allowed. That's kind of all we're talking about, is adding those additional elements that close the gap. So I think that, and I also think that there should be autonomy, right? So I think that if there are people that definitely want a deficit model, or they want extra specialist services that they want to pay for, they should be able to do that as well. I think that there needs to be autonomy for all people, so that people can decide kind of what they want. So an example is, you're going to hear me talk about this lots, is the idea of developmental language disorder. And in New Zealand, we don't diagnose that yet here, and there's lots of discussions about whether we should. And so my concern about being able to diagnose DLD in New Zealand is that in New Zealand, diagnosis is a point of privilege. So you can only get an ADHD or a dyslexia diagnosis really if you're paying for it privately. So it would be the same for DLD, because the Ministry of Education will not be supporting speech language therapists to diagnose that disorder. So we then will end up in a position again where the privileged children end up with the diagnosis of DLD, and the other children or the children whose parents are not paying for it won't get the diagnosis of DID, and they just get left with the label of naughty, defiant, unengaged, and then the kids over here end up with the diagnoses. So I think if we can kind of find a way where both people can get their needs met, then we'll be able to provide service for everyone, because I think people should be able to get a diagnosis if they want to. I've got a dyslexia diagnosis for my child because I had the resources to do it, and I knew it would make her life easier, but I understand that that was a privilege. So yes, I think it can benefit everybody. Does anyone else have anything?
I see Impelo's on the call. Impelo, do you have anything from a South African perspective?
Yeah.
I don't hear Impelo at this stage, but anyone else, please add in. Tracy, while you were talking about, and David was also saying, you know, whatever the change in practice is something that benefits everyone. And that's something that I think when Mershan did his master's, he kind of indicated that as well. So we were looking at a particular group that was marginalized, but actually said that if we changed the practice, it would benefit everyone. And so it isn't a threat to, in some ways, current practices. It's a building up and changing to something that's better for everyone, actually. But as you were talking, and I think what I'm hearing also is just how your approach is very, I'm going to use the word non-disruptive because it's actually very kind and caring. And I'm wondering how then, you know, as you negotiate the power that's in the system, the power, the resistance that's in the system, which everyone feels in a different way. What's your advice about how we take that on? Because it is a profession that has a dominance. It is a history of a colonized practice, and it still continues to be that way. So how do we engage it still? And what you know, what do you do when you feel the resistance?
So I have, Mershan will know this, I have a show not tell model. And so it's easier to show people what you mean than to tell them what you mean. So I just do it and then I explain it. And I kind of just let the results speak for themselves. And because sometimes when we're trying to explain what we do, it just sounds airy-fairy to people, or they're like, that's not the rules, or you can't do it like that. But that's because we have these kind of boundaries that have been set up in our brains that might not even be real. You know, that there might not even actually be rules around some of these things. It's just that we've continued to do things the way we've seen other people doing it. And so it's really, I think, I remind myself and other people that it's about the results, like it's about the outcome. What do we want at the end of the day? So like for the young man I'm meeting at McDonald's tomorrow, the outcome will be that I'll have some information on his communication that I can give to the judge. And I know that Sally will be fine with me doing that, even though that's not really in the rules, because she knows that I can make a good decision on whether that's appropriate for that young person. And it's not something I have to do often, but sometimes I have to do things that are way outside of the box. And so like tomorrow, I will have a cheeseburger at 10 o'clock in the morning. Because I can't take him to McDonald's and then not have anything, because he'll be like, yeah, she's not really real. Yeah, so I think it's just about it's about a show and tell model, I think. And I also just share, really, I'm totally an open book and really super transparent. But I think in Māori we talk about something called mana. That's that feeling on the inside. And so I think everything we do should be done with mana. And that's so you don't get frustrated and then go home and then look back at what you've said and done, and then your mana's impacted. because you've said or done things that aren't tika or don't sit right with you. And I think also we just need to be patient with our colleagues as well, and to remember that they also have come along a journey of being taught things in a particular way. And so sometimes things can feel threatening for them, and they're worried about, what that means for them if everything changes. But I think it's important to remind people, which is why I'm really on about a bicultural model, is that we're not saying everything out. We're not saying people don't need medical care, or that there's not stuff that speech and language therapy can offer. I absolutely think that. It's just that we're missing all of the other layers that wrap around that. Because if we don't get the engagement right, then actually nothing else happens. So it's about getting the engagement right, so the clinical stuff, the Western stuff, becomes meaningful, or else you give it to them but it doesn't mean anything. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Mpilo said it has indicated that he's ready to join the conversation. He was just had to take a phone call. So Mpilo, over to you.
Hello everyone. My name is Mpilo. I work at the University of Pretoria. I teach there in audiology. My master's is in disability studies, and hoping in the next few years I will finish my PhD. Otherwise, otherwise I appreciate the conversation and the perspective that I'm getting out of this conversation. It's something that we've also been trying to engage in at different levels within our teaching, and also at a professional association level. Currently, we're looking into how we can adopt a diversity or inclusive stance on not just in practice, but also in how we promote how we promote the services in our communities, how we we do get, for example, platforms where radio platforms, for example, where we would be invited on a international week for stroke or something like that, and sometimes the whole language used there tends to be very foreign to a lot of people, to an extent that one of the things that we thought about with my friend Ben just finished his PhD also, and we talk about how we can maybe have similar platforms within local radio stations that use local languages. And now we get to that point, are we just going to translate, or are we going to, or is it going to be a reinvention of the wheel, basically, because translation doesn't really give that. It's a cast and paste kind of a situation. So how are we going to work around this, and how are we going to have, is it going to be a traditional conversation back and forth between the presenter and me, or can we present in a different way? So those are the kind of thoughts, because how you deliver the message, it also needs to be inclusive in a way. Yeah. And the traditional way we've been engaging on, let's say, on Dysphagia Week, we would find that, that there's just it's an English radio station, and the person is a white woman who is delivering the how do you now get that into a context like ours? So those are the kind of thoughts we've been having, but I appreciate the conversation. Thank you very much.
And I think that comes back to too, we need to not just be talking about the services that we deliver, but we need to be talking about how we're teaching at our universities and what is the entry criteria, because then we will have a more diverse population that could just be talking in their local communities about what's happened with their whānau's dysphagia and be presenting that on the radio. We can have the people talking to the people without the professional barrier. Like, imagine
that. Sadhna, you can go next.
Hi, good morning. My name is Sadhna Bolton. I'm a speech language therapist working at a public hospital in South Africa. I think for me, one of the biggest concerns in South Africa is that we are training students who come out hating the profession. And the reason being is that the way we train students is there's nothing in the training that they can identify with as being of me or being of self, being of my community. So yes. I graduated about 30 years ago, and I've just recently engaged with a large group of students who said to me, they're all thinking of plan B, because what speech therapy has done to them is totally taken away their self of being. And then I wonder, how is it that these groups of people that we continuously training with the kind of curriculum, and for me in South Africa, decolonization is an academic exercise. I don't see it in training. I don't see it in practice. In practice, it's only change in places where people have tried to make a change. But academics continue to publish papers, but I don't see anything happening on the ground. I've had students tell me that they are told you need to decolonize, and when they try and do an assessment and maybe tweak an assessment form, they're told about validity and reliability and so forth. Yes, but they aren't provided with alternatives. They aren't provided with a way of thinking that changes practice. So for me, it's pretty much we can continue talking about this, but how are we going to start seeing change on the ground, and how are we going to actually hold one another accountable? I've been in forums where professional associations have spoken about this, and they talk about A, B, and C that's going to happen. 5 years later, I see no change. And I think it's only in spaces where people dedicate themselves to wanting to make the change that it happens. But it's for me, it's not where the profession is moving. It's where individuals within their own agenda or their own sense of activism are deciding to change practice. And it's really sad, because we are in a so-called democracy, but nothing's changed. Mm-hmm. That's my 2 cents.
I know what you're saying. And like I said, I was at university, and it was a really, really tricky time. Like, not tricky, I was traumatized. I'm just being honest. I was really traumatized. It was not a good time for me. And I think in New Zealand, we are really lucky to actually be seeing change at a professional level, which is really exciting. So the racism workshop that I held, we had over 150 speech language therapists come to that session, and there's only like 900 speech language therapists in the country, and we only had 150 tickets, and so we sold out. I couldn't do any more. We now have quite a few Māori on the NZSTA board, so because they're in decision-making positions, we now will have, this year we'll have a second Māori, just for Māori speech language therapists, a wānanga, so like a weekend stay over at a marae, where all of the Māori speech language therapists and students can all get together as one collective to think about how we can work together to try and support each other to impact change. And so I think we're lucky as a small country with a small discipline that we kind of all know each other, and we are on a bit of a trajectory forward at the moment. I presented at the Leaders Conference a few months ago, and we had this most amazing session, and I should have showed that to you actually, but I had this visual drawn up of the conversation afterwards. But the themes really were that people know that what we're doing isn't enough, and we need to do more. I don't know how I would manage that in a bigger scale if we didn't have the kind of movement that we do in New Zealand. So I don't know how you can do it at your work. How did you get it going, David?
Oh, well, I remember. Sorry?
at the curriculum level, how did you get that kind of the brilliance to have that done?
Oh, I think it's also like a really slow process, and I had to contend with a lot of resistance since I, started being a speech pathologist. So yeah, but I would say that okay, how did I do it? So far, I haven't done much. I was excited to be part of a working group, Speech Pathology Australia working group, on what was originally called culture, working with culturally and linguistically diverse people. And we've sort of started rewriting the position paper and also the clinical practice guideline, and that's still under review. And so we got interesting responses that started from total rejection to, oh yeah, maybe we could take some of that on board. And so our suggestion will also be, to argue for culturally responsive speech pathology practice rather than saying, oh, this is only about working with those who are classed as other and, and normally seen as the minority. And so this is still under review. And I mean, I'm also, well, I mean, I think the whole task is really so fundamental. And I have to say, it makes me really sad to hear also from students in other countries that they are disenchanted with what the profession is doing. I'm also hearing that from my students. And I basically encourage them to put that in whatever feedback they can provide. And they're often asked to provide feedback or, on their studies. And also I ask them to engage with professional activities. And the more people say, this is not good enough, we have to change, the better. And I think eventually there will be this systemic change coming from, individual people. But at the moment, I would also say, people have to have a lot of resilience, have to put in a lot of energy, and to try and use their positions of power. And I totally agree with that, wherever they can. So it may be, writing, reviewing journal articles, and then making all of these points that are really important, and basically saying, well, on a Western basis, you may have written like an excellent article, but you have not considered culturally responsive practice. And this is why, I suggest like fundamental change to this. And then also, of course, in curriculum committees to sort of argue for, having this consideration of culture and diversity and inclusion going through as a thread through the entire a course, rather than saying, okay, we'll have this one session where we discuss,
Yes.
aspects of this. And but yeah, I mean, I'm working at La Trobe University, and I'm still, in battle mode. And I don't, at the moment, I don't see this fundamental change in that everybody embraces what at the professional level was suggested, but it's more like, oh, now we have to do it. How can we do it? But I don't really see the, like the personal commitment really, but more it's now it's imposed on the university, and we have to respond. And I think this is really difficult. And yeah, how can we have this fundamental change? Like, we had one discussion, and one person had said, well, we have to tear it all apart and start from scratch. And I basically also agree with that. As long as we call the profession, and I mean, it's outrageous in Australia, as long as we call it speech pathology, I don't think there can be the sort of change we need. And so the name of the profession has to change, but I think also the entire approach. And so if we want to do it like in a bicultural way, we cannot focus also our theory on the medical sciences only. We then have to say, okay, humanities, social sciences, these are the fields that bring innovation in the way we want it. And so that, to my mind, it means a radical change of the curriculum. And only if we teach people differently will they also be able to practice differently. So yeah, I'm very passionate about it, and I would be very excited to continue working with this group of people. Yeah, I find that so good that you've got these sessions. So yeah, thank you so much for it. It's been very exciting for me to hear your talk.
It is exciting. I'm excited to have everybody come together. I've only got 50 spots for the session that I'm having in February in Wellington, but I think that those kind of things will be like, they will help fundamental change, because I hope that by the end of the 2 days, people will leave with concrete things that they can actually do the next day that start to implement change. And that they don't do it, they don't end up being the blueberry muffin with the random blueberries, but their muffin turns purple and that everything they do is infused in a way that it's responsive to anybody who's human.
And I'm going to take an opportunity to say power to the purple. Absolutely. Tracy, we've just gone past our deadline, so I'm going to draw this very beautiful conversation to a close. And David, like you said, it's great that we've got this forum, and hopefully we will continue having these conversations in between these sessions. Kia ora, Tracy. Absolutely amazing talk. I loved what you had to say. Thank you. And there's so much I want to pick your brain about as we go into the next few weeks, months, years, lifetimes of doing this work. So thank you very much. And thanks everybody for attending the session, and looking forward to seeing you all again. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ka kite.
Bye.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.